In the deep, suffocating heat of the southern night, where cicadas scream like trapped souls and the wind carries whispers of pain, a sprawling plantation once stood like a kingdom built on suffering. By day, it looked peaceful, golden fields, grand columns, and polished verandas. But beneath that illusion lived fear, chains, and a silence soaked in cruelty. Every wooden beam of the mansion had absorbed the cries of the enslaved. Every brick beneath the soil remembered their blood and exhaustion. The man who ruled this land believed himself untouchable, a god in boots, a judge without mercy, a master who crushed humanity beneath his heel. To him, enslaved people were property, tools, and shadows meant to serve without resistance. But history has a way of returning in the darkest hour, and the oppressed never truly disappear. They wait, they watch, and sometimes they remember. On one storm-torn night when thunder split the sky like a warning, the balance of power shifted. The very man who had lived in terror was about to become the terrified. This is not just a story of revenge. It is a haunting tale of reckoning, justice born from pain, and a punishment so chilling that it echoed far beyond the plantation walls. If stories like this grip your soul, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss a tale buried in history. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Your voice keeps these stories alive. Now take a breath and step with us into the darkness of the past. The plantation first appeared like a painted dream under the southern sun, its white columns gleaming against endless fields of swaying cotton that rippled like a pale sea. From a distance, travelers would see manicured lawns, horses tied beneath sprawling oak trees, and a grand mansion that seemed carved for elegance rather than dominion. Birds circled lazily above, and the air carried the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms, giving the illusion that this land existed in gentle harmony with nature. Yet this beauty was a carefully maintained mask, polished daily to hide what truly lived beneath its surface. Every brick, every beam, and every inch of soil had been shaped not by peace, but by forced hands, relentless labor, and unspoken terror. The estate did not breathe life, it absorbed it, feeding on the silent suffering of those who had no voice within its borders. Behind the mansion, far from the grand veranda and its comfortable rocking chairs, stretched the quarters where the enslaved were forced to live in cramped, decaying cabins. These structures sagged under the weight of neglect, their wooden walls cracked and splintered, their floors uneven and damp from years of use. Smoke curled weakly from their chimneys at dawn, as exhausted men and women prepared for another punishing day. There were no gardens of beauty here, only mud, ash, and broken tools scattered across the ground. Laughter was rare, and when it appeared, it was brief and cautious, quickly swallowed by the atmosphere of constant surveillance. Even in sleep, the enslaved were not free, as patrols often moved through the night like restless shadows. The fields themselves were both lifeline and prison, stretching endlessly toward the horizon as if there were no escape from their grasp. Under the scorching sun, rows of cotton stood like a white labyrinth that trapped anyone who entered it. Overseers paced along the edges with whips resting casually at their sides, their eyes scanning every movement. The soundscape of the plantation was a grim symphony, the snap of twigs beneath boots, the heavy breathing of overworked bodies, the rustle of cotton stalks, and the distant creak of wagon wheels. Even the wind seemed to carry whispers of pain as it moved through the crops, bending them in slow, mournful waves. At the heart of this world stood the master's house, elevated above the land as if it ruled both earth and sky. Tall windows reflected the sunlight like cold eyes, watching everything without revealing anything. Inside, crystal chandeliers glittered above polished floors, where visitors were welcomed with refined hospitality. Yet beneath those floors ran hidden tunnels and storage rooms where punishment tools were kept out of sight. The mansion was not merely a home, it was a command center of control, designed to intimidate anyone who approached. Its grand architecture symbolized absolute power, a constant reminder that one man claimed ownership over countless lives. Discipline on the plantation was not occasional, it was woven into daily existence. Bells marked the beginning and end of labor, their metallic chime echoing across the land like a decree from an unseen authority. Any delay, hesitation, or exhaustion could be interpreted as defiance. Fear was cultivated deliberately, passed from one generation to the next like a bitter inheritance. Mothers warned their children to keep their heads low and their voices soft, knowing that even innocence offered no protection here. Every rule was meant to remind the enslaved that they were considered less than human within this carefully constructed order. Yet, beneath this brutal system flowed an undercurrent of resilience that the plantation could never fully erase. In secret gatherings after dusk, enslaved people shared stories, songs, and fragments of memory that tied them to their lost homes. The land that oppressed them also held their footprints, their tears, and their quiet acts of resistance. These moments of unity existed in stark contrast to the rigid structure imposed upon them by their captors. The plantation thrived on isolation and division, but it could not completely break the human spirit that persisted in hidden corners of its shadow. From the outside, the estate might have seemed like a symbol of prosperity, but in truth, it functioned as a living machine of exploitation, constantly consuming labor while offering nothing in return but suffering. Its beauty was manufactured, its order maintained through cruelty, and its legacy built upon the bodies of those it enslaved. He was a tall man with a carved jaw and a gaze that felt colder than the marble columns of his own mansion. To visitors, he carried himself like a gentleman of wealth, speaking slowly, smiling only when it suited him, and moving with the confidence of someone who believed the world existed for his comfort alone. His boots were always polished, his coat immaculate, and his presence commanded silence the moment he stepped onto the veranda. Yet beneath this polished exterior lived a mind trained in domination, calculation, and control. He did not see land as living earth or people as breathing beings, but as assets to be measured, exploited, and disciplined. Every decision he made revolved around profit, power, and the preservation of his absolute authority over the plantation. Within the estate, he ruled more like a monarch than a farmer, issuing commands that echoed across fields and cabins alike. His word was law, unquestionable and feared, and even the overseers trembled when summoned to his office. He kept detailed ledgers, not only of crops and livestock, but of every enslaved person under his control, reducing human lives to numbers on paper. If production fell, punishment followed without hesitation. If an enslaved person showed exhaustion, he labeled it laziness. If they spoke too boldly, he called it rebellion. Compassion was not part of his vocabulary, and mercy was considered a weakness that could threaten his dominance. His cruelty was not always loud or explosive, but often subtle and deeply psychological. He took pleasure in reminding the enslaved of their position, casually referring to them as his property even in public gatherings. At dinners with neighboring landowners, he would boast about how strictly he maintained order, presenting his brutality as discipline and his oppression as necessary governance. He believed that fear was the strongest tool of leadership and ensured that every person on his land understood the consequences of crossing him. This created an atmosphere where dread lingered in every corner of the plantation, silently shaping behavior through anticipation of punishment. The master also cultivated loyalty among certain overseers and favored servants by granting them small privileges, knowing that division would weaken collective resistance. Some were given slightly better quarters, extra rations, or reduced labor, turning them into reluctant instruments of his control. He watched these dynamics carefully, manipulating relationships like pieces on a board. To him, this was not cruelty, but strategy, a method to keep his empire intact. The plantation functioned less like a community and more like a rigid hierarchy designed to protect his power at all costs. Despite his harshness, he saw himself as a civilized man, often quoting scripture to justify his actions. In his mind, the enslaved were destined to serve, and his role was to maintain what he believed to be divine order. He attended church regularly, dressed in fine attire and prayed openly, yet showed no remorse for the suffering he inflicted. This contradiction made his character even more chilling, as he wrapped his brutality in a cloak of moral righteousness. To challenge him was not only to defy a man, but what he claimed was God's will. On the plantation grounds, his presence could be felt even when he was absent. His influence hung in the air like an invisible weight, shaping every movement and whispered conversation. The enslaved learned to recognize the sound of his horse, the rhythm of his footsteps, and the sharpness of his voice from a distance. Children were taught to lower their eyes when he passed, and elders warned that even a moment of perceived disrespect could bring devastating consequences. In this way, he ruled not just through direct force, but through an ever-present climate of intimidation. Yet beneath his iron exterior lay a deep insecurity that few recognized. He feared losing control more than anything else, terrified that the very people he oppressed might one day rise against him. This fear drove him to tighten his grip even further, making his rule harsher and more unpredictable. Every act of cruelty was both an assertion of dominance and a desperate attempt to protect his fragile sense of power. He moved through the plantation like a shadow that had learned how to breathe, present in every field, yet never fully visible to those who claimed ownership over him. To the master and overseers, he appeared quiet, obedient, and unremarkable, a man who spoke little and kept his eyes lowered. Yet beneath that still exterior lived a mind that absorbed everything, mapping the rhythms of the land, the habits of the guards, and the moods of the household. His silence was not submission. It was a form of survival, carefully cultivated over years of watching others break under cruelty. Every scar on his back carried a memory, and every memory sharpened his understanding of the world that imprisoned him. In the cabins at night, when the plantation fell into uneasy darkness, he lay awake while others slept, listening to the wind and the distant creak of the mansion's floors. He remembered fragments of a life before bondage, faint images of open skies and voices that once called him by a name that did not belong to a master. Those memories were fragile, yet he clung to them as proof that he was more than the label forced upon him. His endurance was not loud rebellion, but a quiet refusal to let his spirit be erased, even when his body was worn down by relentless labor. During the day, he worked with steady discipline, never drawing attention to himself, yet noticing every injustice that unfolded around him. He saw children separated from their mothers, elders discarded when they could no longer labor, and men beaten for the smallest perceived offense. Instead of reacting outwardly, he stored these moments deep inside, allowing them to shape his resolve. His strength came from patience, an understanding that survival required both restraint and awareness in a world designed to crush him. Other enslaved people sometimes turned to him for comfort, sensing his calm presence amid chaos. He did not offer grand speeches or promises of freedom, but his quiet support carried weight. A hand on a shoulder, a shared piece of bread, or a brief nod was enough to remind others they were not alone. In this way, he became a silent anchor within the community, holding together fragments of humanity that the plantation tried to destroy. Yet his endurance was not without pain. Inside, he carried a storm of grief, anger, and longing that threatened to overwhelm him. There were moments when the weight of oppression pressed so heavily that breathing felt like an act of rebellion. Still, he learned to channel that inner turmoil into controlled resilience, believing that to survive was itself a form of resistance. Each dawn he greeted with the same steady resolve, refusing to let despair define him. He also observed the master closely, studying his patterns, his fears, and his vulnerabilities. While others trembled at the sound of his boots, the enslaved man watched with measured attention, understanding that even tyrants were bound by their own weaknesses. This awareness did not make him arrogant, only cautious, as he knew that one misstep could mean death. His endurance was thus both emotional and strategic, a delicate balance between survival and self-preservation. Over time, his silent strength became woven into the very fabric of the plantation, an unspoken presence that could neither be fully controlled nor completely broken. Though chains bound his body, his mind remained alert, his spirit unyielding, and his humanity intact beneath layers of suffering that tried endlessly to bury it. The breaking point did not arrive in a single dramatic moment, but crept in slowly like a wound that refused to heal. It grew through years of small humiliations, sleepless nights, and memories that resurfaced whenever the whip cracked across another back. He carried this weight silently, believing endurance was his only shield, yet each day added another invisible scar to his spirit. The field no longer felt like soil beneath his feet, but like a battlefield where his humanity was dragged through dust. Even the rhythm of his breath began to feel borrowed, as if every inhale belonged to the master who claimed his body. It deepened when he witnessed a young mother dragged away from her child at sunrise, her cries echoing far beyond the cotton rows. The child stood frozen, eyes empty, clutching a torn piece of cloth that smelled like her. In that instant, something inside him cracked, not loudly, but with a quiet finality that could never be repaired. He realized that survival without dignity was merely a slow form of death. The sun that morning felt harsher, the air heavier, and the plantation more like a living prison than ever before. Nights became unbearable, filled with restless memories that circled his mind like crows. He replayed every injustice he had seen, every lash, every insult, every family torn apart. Sleep abandoned him, and when it came, it brought dreams of chains tightening around his chest. He began to feel that endurance, once his greatest strength, was turning into a cage that bound him more tightly than iron ever could. His heart ached with a mixture of grief and anger that he could no longer swallow. During the day, he noticed how the master's confidence wavered in small ways, how his voice grew sharper, how his eyes darted with unease. This awareness fueled the storm inside him, convincing him that oppression was not unbreakable. Yet the cost of action weighed heavily on his soul. He knew that defiance could mean death, but submission felt increasingly like surrendering his very existence. The tension inside him stretched thin, trembling on the edge of rupture. The breaking point sharpened further after he saw an elder beaten for collapsing from exhaustion. The man had worked his entire life on the plantation, yet was discarded like a broken tool. Blood stained the dirt where he fell, and no one was allowed to help. Watching this, the enslaved man felt something cold settle deep within his chest, a realization that mercy would never come from those who ruled this land. Compassion existed only among the oppressed, not their oppressors. In the cabins, whispers began to spread, not of rebellion, but of despair so deep it bordered on madness. People spoke in fragmented sentences, their voices trembling with years of buried pain. He listened, absorbing their stories, recognizing his own suffering reflected in theirs. The collective sorrow of his people pressed against him like a tide, pushing him closer to a decision he had long avoided. The plantation no longer felt like a place to endure, but a place that demanded something decisive. That final tipping moment arrived quietly, not with thunder or fire, but with a simple, unbearable clarity that flooded his mind at dusk. As the sky darkened and shadows crept across the fields, he understood that his spirit could no longer remain trapped in silence. The weight of every injustice, every stolen moment, every shattered family converged inside him, gathering into a single, irreversible resolve that lingered in the stillness of the approaching night. The storm arrived like a living thing, crawling up from the horizon with a black belly of thunder and a breath that tasted of iron. Clouds piled upon one another until the sky seemed to sag toward the earth, as if it intended to crush the plantation beneath its weight. The wind moved first, rattling shutters, bending oak branches, and sending dry leaves skittering across the yard like frightened animals. Inside the fields, the cotton swayed violently, no longer soft and harmless but sharp and restless, whispering secrets that no overseer could understand. Lightning split the darkness in jagged veins of white, briefly revealing the mansion as a towering skeleton against the night. In the cabins, people sat in silence, feeling that this storm was not merely weather, but a reckoning written in the sky itself. Rain began as scattered drops that struck the ground with deliberate cruelty, each one sounding like a warning. Soon it became a torrential sheet that hammered roofs, flooded paths, and turned the dirt into slick, treacherous mud. The plantation no longer looked grand. It looked exposed, stripped of its polished illusion, and laid bare under the rage of the heavens. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again, deep and guttural, vibrating through bones and walls alike. Even the animals grew uneasy, horses whinnying, dogs whining, and cattle huddling together in dark barns. The air felt thick with anticipation, as though something unseen was moving through it, watching, waiting, breathing. Within this chaos, the enslaved man stepped quietly out of his cabin, the rain soaking his clothes in seconds. He did not rush, nor did he hesitate, his movement steady despite the violence around him. Mud clung to his feet, but he walked as if guided by an invisible force that would not allow him to turn back. Each flash of lightning carved his figure into sharp relief against the night, revealing a face hardened not by hatred, but by unwavering resolve. The storm roared above him, yet he moved beneath it as though he belonged to its rhythm, part of its fury rather than a victim of it. The mansion loomed ahead like a fortress battered by the elements, its tall windows glowing dimly behind rain-streaked glass. Inside, Candles flickered and servants moved nervously, sensing the tension, but not its source. The master paced restlessly across polished floors, irritated by the storm that disrupted his comfort and reminded him of forces beyond his control. He listened to the thunder with thinly veiled contempt, believing even nature should bend to his will. Yet there was a tightness in his chest he could not explain, a prickling sensation that made him glance toward the darkened yard again and again. Outside, the enslaved man stopped at the edge of the veranda, water streaming down his face like silent tears. He studied the building that had ruled his life, every column, every step, every shadow now etched into his memory. Lightning flashed once more, and for a heartbeat the mansion seemed to tremble, its grandeur reduced to a fragile outline against the storm. The wind howled through the trees, carrying distant murmurs that sounded almost like voices from the past. In that moment, the night felt alive with the weight of every injustice that had ever occurred on this land. Inside, the master felt an unfamiliar chill creep up his spine, something deeper than fear and more unsettling than anger. He moved to a window and peered through the rain, catching a fleeting glimpse of a lone figure standing in the darkness. Another crash of thunder exploded overhead, shaking the glass and momentarily plunging the room into blackness. When the light returned, the yard appeared empty, yet the sense of being watched lingered like a cold hand around his throat. His confidence wavered for the first time that evening, though pride would not allow him to name it. Beyond the house, the storm reached its peak, lightning tearing open the sky while rain fell in relentless sheets that blurred the world into a single trembling mass. The plantation seemed suspended between past and future, between oppression and something unknown. Every sound, every flash, every gust of wind pressed toward a single, inevitable turning point that hovered just beyond the edge of sight. Inside the mansion, the air thickened like clotting smoke, though no fire burned anywhere in the house. Candles trembled on their stands as if they were breathing, their flames stretching and shrinking with every distant crack of thunder. Servants moved along the walls, keeping their heads low, yet their footsteps sounded louder than they should on the polished floor. The master tried to maintain his composure, but his reflection in the tall mirrors appeared distorted, his figure wavering as though the glass itself refused to hold his image steady. Somewhere beneath the floorboards came a low creak, not from the storm, but from something shifting in the darkness below. For the first time in years, the house did not feel like a fortress. It felt like a trap, slowly tightening around its own ruler. Then the lights began to fail one by one, not in a sudden blackout, but in an eerie, deliberate pattern. A candle on the left died, then one on the right, then another near the staircase, leaving the room fragmented by moving shadows. Each extinguished flame sounded like a silent judgment. The master's breathing quickened, his hand gripping the edge of a marble table as he scanned the room. The portraits of his ancestors seemed to lean forward from their frames, their painted eyes following his every movement. Rain battered the window so fiercely that the glass trembled, yet through it all came an unsettling stillness, as if the storm outside and the house inside were conspiring together. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, slow and measured, though no servant had been summoned. They did not sound hurried or angry, only calm, controlled, and impossibly close. The master turned toward the door, calling out, but his voice cracked before it could reach full strength. No answer came, only the rhythmic tread of boots that felt heavier than any human stride. With each step, the temperature in the room dropped, and his breath appeared in pale wisps before his face. The familiar corridors of his own home suddenly felt endless, twisting into darkness he had never noticed before. A shape emerged at the threshold, not rushing, not threatening, simply present. The enslaved man stood there, soaked in rain, unmoving, his silhouette carved against the flickering candlelight. Water dripped from his clothes onto the polished floor, leaving dark trails that spread like ink. His face showed neither rage nor fear, only an unbearable calm that unnerved the master far more than open defiance ever could. In that silence, power shifted without a single word being spoken. The master realized with a sinking dread that this was no ordinary confrontation, but the culmination of years of hidden endurance.